Ladies and gentlemen, politics is the art of deception and self-deception. It operates not only with fake news, that is the buzzword, but it operates also with fake history, fake law, and fake diplomacy. The Cyprus issues are inseparable from British imperialism, the two British sovereign bases, areas in Akrotiri and Chekelia, and other retained sites in the Republic of Cyprus. Demonstrably, the UK brought enormous pressure on the United Nations so as to prolong as long as possible the neo-colonial interests of the United Kingdom. Indeed, the UK's two military bases on Cyprus are a crucial factor that cannot be ignored. In the Annan Plan of 2004, which, as I said, has nothing to do with Annan, I mean, his name was misused for it. In the Annan Plan, the United Nations essentially capitulated to the demands of Lord David Hanning. I suppose you know the name, the then UK representative, and from 1996 to 2003, the United Nations Special Representative in Cyprus. The Annan Plan was accepted, as you know, by the Turkish Cypriots, but rejected by 76% of the Greek Cypriot population. The other major factor is the geopolitical and geoeconomic interest of Turkey, which in 1974 illegally occupied 37% of the territory of Cyprus, expelled 200,000 Greek Cypriots from the north of the island to the south, and looted its churches and convents. As everybody knows, or you would know it, but certainly not the average American in New York would not know that you could buy Cypriot mosaics and Cypriot frescoes that had been torn off the churches. And they went throughout the world, you know, for collectors. And of course, a major crime in the sense of UNESCO and World Heritage. Some of those mosaics and other cultural goods have been returned, but a certain number are still, of course, at large. The factor that has had perhaps the least weight has been the legitimate interests of the majority Greek Cypriot population, whose ancestors have lived on the island for 5,000 years. The European Union is based, as you know, on three pillars: democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. All three are being violated since 1974, day by day, by the continued Turkish occupation. The United Nations military presence in Cyprus guarantees the safety of the Greek Cypriots from further Turkish aggressions, but it has not been successful in undoing the crimes of the occupants or in obtaining any kind of accountability from them. Interstate complaints before the European Court of Human Rights, binding judgments of the European Court in the cases Cyprus against Turkey, the famous case of 2001, the follow-up case of 2014, concerning, among other things, the missing persons, the landmark judgments of 1996 and 1998 in the Loizidu against Turkey cases have not changed the situation on the ground. It suffices to quote from the 2014 European Court judgment, unimplemented, of course. I quote, "The court has been at the forefront of an international trend using just satisfaction to prevent further violations of human rights and punish wrongdoing governments. The acknowledgement of punitive or exemplary damages under the Convention is essential in at least 3 cases. 1, gross violations of human rights. 2, prolonged deliberate non-compliance with judgments. 3, the severe curtailment or threat thereof of the applicant's human rights with the purpose of avoiding, impairing, or restricting his or her access to the court. Therefore, punitive damages are an appropriate and necessary instrument for fulfilling the court's mission to uphold human rights in Europe and ensuring the observance of the engagements undertaken by the contracting parties in the Convention and the protocols thereto. The conclusion applies with even greater force in the case at hand when the respondent state not only committed a multitude of gross human rights violations over a significant period of time in northern Cyprus and did not investigate the most significant of these violations adequately and in a timely manner, especially with regard to the missing persons, but also deliberately failed year after year to comply with the Grand Chamber's judgment on the merits delivered a long time ago with regard to these specific violations, end of quote. Now, here you have a classical situation of impunity, but we've seen it in many other cases. I'm an American, and the judgment of the International Court of Justice in the case Nicaragua against the United States, of course, is for the bin. Obviously, the United States did not implement it, and the judgments in La Grande against the United States, judgment of Avena against the United States, the death row people, the La Grande brothers were executed in spite of interim measures of protection issued by the International Court of Justice. Same thing in the case of Avena and 51 others. So, for several decades, United Nations negotiations have been taking place in an attempt to solve the key issues surrounding the illegal occupation of Cyprus by Turkey. Have these negotiations been more than just a smokescreen to maintain the status quo? They have failed because of the lack of good faith on the part of Turkey, which essentially dictates what the representatives of Northern Cyprus can say and what they must not agree to. Dragging on since 1974, that means 45 years. The situation parallels the fake discussions and pseudo-negotiations that have taken place between the United Nations and Israel since the illegal occupation of Palestine in 1967 and the adoption of Security Council Resolution 242. There was a so-called road plan for Palestine, which was tantamount to surrender to the interests of Israel and an abandonment of hundreds of UN resolutions on the subject, just like the Annan Plan entailed a surrender to Turkey and an abandonment of the commitments made in so many UN resolutions. I assume that the fountain in Nicosia with all the resolutions is still there. I remember that made quite an impact on me. Notwithstanding countless General Assembly resolutions and the key Security Council resolutions concerning Cyprus, the illegal situation prevails. Allow me to mention just a few of these resolutions. Certainly, the first resolution of 1960, admitting Cyprus to membership in the UN, resolutions 353 and 354 of 20 and 23 July 74 at the time of the invasion, calling for an immediate ceasefire and the withdrawal of Turkish forces from northern Cyprus. Resolution 355, deploring the death of UN peacekeeping forces. There are several resolutions every time that US peacekeeping forces perish. There was a resolution. Resolutions 357 and 358 of 14 and 15 August 74, condemning the resumption of fighting in August 1974. Resolution 360, reaffirming the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Cyprus. Resolution 541, very important resolution, of 18 November 1983, rejecting the Declaration of Independence of Northern Cyprus, and Resolution 550 of May 1984, condemning secessionist activities and condemning the exchange of ambassadors between Turkey and Northern Cyprus. I'll skip a little text here. I just want to say the mandate of the UN mission there gets renewed every 6 months. And the last time was by Resolution 2453 of 30 January 2019, which means now will be renewed again. And if you compare them, you know, it's like cut-paste, it's the same language. Every 6 months, the Secretary General issues a report to the Security Council in which he discusses the situation in Cyprus and makes recommendations to the mission. Of course, cut and paste. There's not a heck of a lot of new stuff there. Interesting, the meetings that have been taking place recently between the Turkish Cypriot leader Mustafa Akinci and the Greek Cypriot leader Nikos Anastasiadis. They usually meet in the Chief of Missions residence in the United Nations protected area under the auspices of the current Special Representative, the Deputy Special Advisor to the Secretary General on Cyprus, Mrs. Elizabeth Spehar. I think she is a lot better than Alvaro de Soto. Yes. Mr. Anastasiadis presented his ideas on decentralization, and the two leaders discussed basic principles of cooperation. Regarding confidence-building measures, the leaders committed to intensifying the work of the technical committees with the objective of improving the daily lives of all Cypriots. They announced that the interconnectivity of the two electricity grids, as agreed in 2015, has now been achieved. In this regard, they decided to make the temporary electricity supply arrangement permanent and without restriction. So, I mean, there's some progress.
Unlike the telephone.
Yeah. And there's always room for improvement. The leaders agreed to the clearance of mine-suspected hazardous areas. It's amazing. 45 years after the war, there's still a problem of mines on both sides of the island. As a gesture of goodwill, Mr. Akinci conveyed the decision of the Turkish Cypriot side to return, finally, paintings by Greek Cypriot artists that had been, shall we say, kept under protection in northern Cyprus. Late in 2018, in October, there was another constructive meeting. I mean, as I said, my feeling was rather positive. I thought that the communities were reasonable. It's just the pressure of the Brits and the pressure of the Turks that make a reasonable deal between the two communities rather difficult. A new source of conflict has recently arisen, as you all know from the press. Not between the Greek and Turkish communities, but between Turkey and the Republic of Cyprus. Today, we are facing new tensions because Turkey is intent on exploiting the offshore natural resources of Cyprus, and this violates the exclusive economic zone and the sovereignty of Cyprus. It is disturbing, but not surprising, that the European Union is not taking effective measures, other than blah blah, to make it clear to Turkey that the European Union will not tolerate Turkey's looting the natural resources of Cyprus. After all, Cyprus is a member of the EU. You would expect a bit more muscle from the European Union. Turkey has recently launched 2 drilling ships to conduct natural gas operations off the northeast coast of Cyprus for 3 months, a move which aggravates the conflict with Cyprus over jurisdiction rights for oil and gas exploration. Turkey's energy minister, Fatih Domnas, said that this ship, the new one, the Yavuz, launched the other day from the port of Dilovasi in the Marmara Sea, would operate in a borehole near the Karpas Peninsula to the east of Cyprus and reach a depth of 3,300 meters. An earlier Turkish ship, the Fatih, has been operating in the west of Cyprus. Last week, the government of Cyprus issued arrest warrants for its crew. And Turkey has stated that it has a 5-year business plan and that the crew of the Yavuz currently consists of 150 individuals, of whom 53 are Turkish nationals. Greece, which backs the Cypriot government, has called on the European Council to condemn Ankara's actions in the region. Last week, on 21st June, the EU threatened, at least that, threatened to impose sanctions on Turkey if it continues illegal drilling in waters near Cyprus. Illegal drilling, I'm putting it in quotation marks because that's what the EU threat actually referred to. The warning came at a EU summit in Brussels. Commission President, I don't know for how many more weeks, Jean-Claude Juncker called Turkey's actions totally unacceptable. Meanwhile, the European Council called on Turkey to, quote, show restraint, respect the sovereign rights of Cyprus, and refrain from any such actions in the future. The European Commission's 2019 report on Turkey, now this is a general report, that was just issued 29th of May. Focuses on the state of emergency introduced on 15 July 2016 in the aftermath of the attempted coup in Turkey. I mean, the number of violations is astronomical. I've never seen, I mean, having worked 25 years for the United Nations in the field of human rights, to have thousands of judges dismissed, to have 600 judges jailed without rule of law, without trial. 3,000 journalists, they hold the record for the number of jailed journalists. And dismissed thousands upon thousands of civil servants, teachers, anybody who was remotely connected with the so-called Gülen movement. I mean, Gülen, everybody calls him a preacher. I mean, I think Gülen essentially is a scholar. And what he does, he has a worldwide system of education of schools. It's like the Brothers of La Salle or the Brother Rice Brothers or the Catholic schools. I mean, it has a huge system of schools in Africa, in Asia, in the United States, etc. But since he is not a lackey of Mr. Erdogan, he is the enemy. It's the sort of thing you always look for a scapegoat. It's an identifiable individual that you can blame everything on. Not that I like Gülen. I read a book on him once, but I don't know much about him. In any event, concerning Cyprus, now I'm skipping the report of the European Commission because it's too long. Concerning Cyprus, the Commission recalled the European Council statement of March 2018 condemning Turkey's continued illegal actions in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Aegean. It also recalled Turkey's obligation to respect international law and good neighborly relations, and called on Turkey to respect the sovereign rights of Cyprus to explore and exploit its natural resources. Now, skipping again, the EU reminded Turkey of its obligations under the UN Convention on the law of the sea, because there are major violations of UNCLOS by Turkey. But again, the mainstream media gives you very little of this. I mean, if you know that I was the first rapporteur to go in 21 years to go to Venezuela. Now, Michelle Bachelet was there last week, but I was the first UN rapporteur to go in 21 years. And the thing is, since I'm not singing the song they want me to sing, I don't exist. My report doesn't exist. I mean, I'm used to that, you know, it comes with the job. In any event, the same as they play down the crimes of Turkey, they magnify what's going on in, now under a generally accepted notion of self-determination, any change in the political status of a colony or non-self-governing territory must be based on the, quote, freely expressed wishes of the established inhabitants of the territory. Why do I say that? Because what are we going to do with the 120,000 settlers? If it's not 140,000 by now, 150,000. Everybody knows that 4th Geneva Convention, Article 49, Paragraph 6, specifically prohibits demographic manipulation, specifically prohibits bringing your own citizens into occupied territory. Now, at the time I did my research for this, which was the early 2000s, 2005, at that time there were definitely 120,000 Anatolian Turks who had been brought there. Now, I have solidarity, sympathy, compassion for them because they're human beings. They have the same rights that we do. On the other hand, that doesn't mean, it's the same thing with Article 25 of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. That doesn't mean that they have the right to vote. That's something else. I mean, we're not going to subject them to any humiliation or any kind of arbitrary expulsion or whatever you have to take into account. Right now they have children, and the children were born there, and the children have married and probably intermarried with the Greek Cypriots. So that has to be done humanely, and not by force. But for that, we can, as we always say, create a commission to see on a case-by-case basis how you can solve these issues. If anybody has the full text of the lecture, you will see that there's a lot of interesting stuff on the manipulations that were done in the case of Alaska. Apply this to these precedents to the Cyprus situation. It is clear that the 140,000 Turkish settlers who were implanted in northern Cyprus following the illegal occupation of the territory in 1974 do not have a right in international law to participate in a self-determination referendum or in a referendum to adopt a constitutional convention. Of course, the Greek Cypriots may want to be particularly generous. I mean, if the Cypriot communities wish to accord them this opportunity or to accord the right to vote under appropriate guidelines, that is their business. It's like when I wrote my report on Venezuela, I said, I don't pronounce myself for Maduro, for Guaido. It's none of my business. I mean, I'm not Venezuelan. But they do have a right to equal access to the rule of law. They have the right to the same human rights that we enjoy. Now, what rights do the Turkish settlers have? They enjoy all the rights guaranteed by the Cypriot constitution and the rights to which Cyprus is bound pursuant to international treaties, including the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. While the Republic of Cyprus may grant the Turkish settlers special rights, Cyprus is under no obligation to grant them citizenship or even the right to continued residence in the territory. Marriage with a native Turkish population, old age, and the health of the individuals concerned are, of course, considerations that the Cyprus government would have to take into account on a case-by-case basis. Now, the Cyprus communities are free to reach compromises and to empower the settlers to vote if they so wish. This, however, is not mandated by international practice. The guiding principle must remain the respect of the human dignity of all persons residing in Cyprus and the readiness to make prudent concessions. The principle of humanity must always temper the mathematical application of international law. A durable solution is always one that all parties are willing to live with, in the sense of metron ariston, maiden agan. One last point concerns the limitation of Cypriot sovereignty entailed by the presence of Turkish troops in the north and by the presence of the British base areas. The charter must include, I skipped a whole page where I speak about a charter that the Constitutional Convention should write. So now I come to say the charter said you don't know anything about the charter. It's in the text. The charter must ensure that these actors do not in any way influence the free exercise of self-determination by the people of Cyprus. The United Nations General Assembly may consider, and this is almost a template, I mention it in almost every case. The General Assembly may consider elevating this legal question to the International Court of Justice for an advisory opinion. The question on the validity of the British-based treaties and of the guarantee treaties of 1960. I mean, these are totally obsolete. These are colonial. They must go. But I mean, the fact that I say it, or my colleague Idris Yasairi says it, or that my colleague Juan Pablo Slaski says it, that doesn't cut any ice. It has to come a bit higher from the International Court of Justice. An advisory opinion would also address the issue of the legal consequences of the Turkish occupation of 37% of the territory of Cyprus, the status of the Turkish settlers, and the level of reparation owed by Turkey to the people of Cyprus. You probably do not know that there is a new rapporteurship in the family of UN rapporteurs, and that is the UN rapporteur on the promotion of truth, justice, reparation, and assurances of non-recurrence. Right now, it's my friend Fabian Salvioli, a professor of law at Buenos Aires University. In any event, right to truth, right to justice, right to reparation, that's exactly up your alley. I mean, you should write him, send him information, because we rapporteurs, essentially, we don't get any guidelines. We don't get any, I mean, the Human Rights Council can ask me to write something. They never did. But usually the initiative comes from you. You select what are the topics that you, as an independent expert, consider to be important. And so if a rapporteur receives from civil society, from persons who are concerned with a particular issue, says, why don't you study this matter? This matter has been totally neglected. This matter never makes it to the mainstream media. Why don't you look at that? I would say it is an avenue that I would suggest that you try out. And now I'm in your hands. If you have any questions, as I said, I literally skipped about 7 pages of the text. So that gives at least you the opportunity to engage in a little bit of interactive dialogue. Thanks.
I'm sorry, maybe I should, so that, I don't know if you are aware of what the Kofi Annan plan was. I have both a Cyprus and a British passport, and I have my house in Kyrenia. With my Cyprus passport, I cannot go to Kyrenia to claim my house because I'm a person non grata. With my British passport, because I'm European Union, I can go to Kyrenia and buy back my house without any problem. Not to get it back, but I can buy it.
Back.
Voilà. This is what the Kofi Annan plan was all about.
No, as I said, it is like the fountain in Nicosia.
Yes.
It is taking all of these resolutions of the General Assembly and Security Council and throwing them out. And
the other thing I wanted to say about the British bases, as you know, recently there was a court case concerning the bases in Mauritius. And of course, they won.
Chagos Island.
Yeah,
Chagos Island
so,
case.
voilà. So now we have a case to go to court concerning the bases in Cyprus. And since they had all the problems with Brexit, it was something that we had to negotiate, especially in Cyprus, because there are a lot of British living in Cyprus, and because there are Cypriots working on the bases. So we have to have a special subject for this Brexit arrangement. And
the issue of the settlers that you mentioned in your talk. So you said on the one hand, international law prohibits effectively using settlers, right, as a political tool. But on the other hand, you said that you have to view also the humanitarian aspect of it. So I'd like to ask from an international law perspective, what rights do the settlers have now?
Well, as I said,
are there certain provisions in international
The
law?
human rights covenants engage the responsibility of the state and guarantee the rights of all persons under the jurisdiction of that state. Meaning, since both Turkey and Cyprus are states bodies to the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, to the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, they all have the full protection of these 2 covenants. And it's pretty broad protection. But when it comes to things like voting, Article 25 does not grant voting rights to non-citizens. And also the issue of residence, that is not determined in the text of the conventions. The only thing is that there's another convention, I don't know to what extent both Cyprus and Turkey have signed it, the Convention on the Elimination of Statelessness.
okay.
That poses, again, an obstacle. Yeah.
What you have.
I had the honor of being member of the committee for a European solution in Cyprus back in 2005, 2006. And we produced this document, which exists in French and German, which is a principal basis for a just and lasting Cyprus settlement in the light of international law and European law. So basically what we were trying to do with this, and actually I gave it personally to Papadopoulos, the late Prime Minister, and also to Mehmet Ali, the president of the then northern part of Turkey. Now they have other leaders, but in any event, we had the impression that both sides, the communities, were interested in our work. They thought that what we were doing was constructive, had future. But of course, the so-called Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus has no sovereignty, no independence. It does what Erdogan tells it to do. So his it's obvious that this is not in the interests of Erdogan, as it was not in the interests of Ecevit either. So the fact is that this, as good as it is as a proposal, has not been implemented. I remember Alvaro de Soto at the time, and Alvaro de Soto and the German Commissioner Verheugen. So Verheugen nearly had apoplexy because these people deceived themselves. These people, as arrogant as they are, they really thought that they were going to cajole the Greek Cypriots into approving this foul deal. And I remember I was teaching on the Thursday just before the referendum. I was teaching at the Hôtel Métropole, and I told my students, I'm taking bets. The Greek Cypriots are going to reject this by 65%. That was my guess. They rejected it by 76. So if you really want to throw the Annan Plan and whatever, you want to force it down the throats of the Greek Cypriots, then do it through the parliament, do it through representative democracy, but don't do it through direct democracy. I mean, if you're going to ask the people, do you want to commit suicide? Well, maybe they say no. So, I mean, that was the risk that Alvaro de Soto took. And I thought that he was such a bad international civil servant because to have given this Annan Plan the name of Kofi Annan, when Kofi Annan had nothing to do with it. I mean, just his name was used. But that is having your boss walk into an open knife. The embarrassment was enormous. But it is disappointing when those countries that you would think would be the bulwarks, those countries that you would think be defending the rule of law, human rights, democracy, are the countries who are only interested in money and business and just sell you down the river. They throw you in front of the bus and they don't even, blink. So, I mean, United Kingdom, as long as they're making money, when I say United Kingdom, I say the United States. We may be facing World War III with Iran in the next weeks or months. And why that? Money. I mean, war profiteering, military industrial complex. And unfortunately, a population that is so badly informed, so indoctrinated. I mean, if you read New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, CNN, Fox, I mean, you're just getting pure propaganda. You're not getting the facts. I mean, if you want to be informed as what's going on in the world, you have no choice but to go into alternative media. You have to read, not that I like it, I mean, everybody lies. Al Jazeera lies, RT lies, Telesur lies, but once you have checked out all these liars, put them all together in your own cocktail, you end up with a synthesis, and you get an idea of what's actually going on. Because, I mean, the Brits will lie in one direction, the Russians will lie in another direction, so you think, compare the two, and you arrive at some. But what I always tell the Cypriots, as I also tell victims of human rights violations, I tell the indigenous, is don't give up. Just don't give up. You know your rights. You know what you should have. Maybe at a later date, the constellation will allow it. Right now, it's difficult, but it may be possible. So don't be overly pessimistic. And I think Titina was always very optimistic. I had the feeling that, and Titina didn't give a damn, I think, about the money. She was only interested in the principle that she would win that case against the Turks. And I can can only applaud the then members of the European Court of Human Rights who had the courage to come out with that kind of a clear decision. I wish that all decisions were as clear as that.
Her father was a doctor, and when the people of Carolina, 760 of them, were in prison in the Dome Hotel, her father was there, and he was treating the sick people.
In any event, I am privileged to have known Titina, as I'm privileged to have known Adresse. Yes?
Why was there no follow-up to Titina? Other cases,
Yeah.
many.
There should have been. I know there are some, but relatively few. Actually,
left in abeyance for a long time.
yeah, what you need is somehow the subject matter is not considered politically correct or sexy or anything like that. No, I'll give you an example. When I was head of petitions at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, I was more or less registrar. I mean, all petitions for the Human Rights Committee, Committee Against Torture, Committee of the Elimination of Racial Discrimination came to me. And then I could channel them into the right procedure. We were flooded with death row cases. Why? I mean, the priority number one in human rights was capital punishment. Do away with capital punishment. Sure, I'm against capital punishment. I think it's silly. On the other hand, is it really priority number one, or two, or three? But that was the case. And why that? Because Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the International Service of Human Rights, all of the big NGOs and the law firms considered this their ticket to heaven. I mean, they were suddenly the good guys. They were suddenly the ones who were fighting for human rights, and human rights was abolishing the death penalty. And that way, it's kind of like a red herring. You distract. You deflect all attention toward the death penalty, so you have no time to discuss the other human rights issues. So you can continue violating economic, social, and cultural rights of the population as long as you can call yourselves.
So they won't accept my case in the court because there's no, it's flooded by other cases.
Well, the European Court of Human Rights has a provision whereby you have to present a case within 6 months of the exhaustion of domestic remedies. Now, Loizito did that, but I suppose by now domestic remedies, because they are essentially non-existent. I find this requirement of exhausting domestic remedies is only meaningful if remedies are available and effective. If remedies are only on paper, but nobody gets his right, then you don't have to exhaust it. But the European Court of Human Rights is so overwhelmed with cases. They have something like 80,000 backlog or something like this, astronomical. That they are just en masse declaring things inadmissible. So if you were to submit a case to the European Court, you almost certainly would get an inadmissibility decision. Whereas in the Human Rights Committee, we don't have that 6-month requirement, but decisions of the Human Rights Committee are not final. And if Turkey allows itself to disregard binding judgments, you can imagine with regard to an opinion of the experts of the Human Rights Committee, what do they care? They would only care if Hurriyet would find it interesting. If the media were truly free in Turkey, and of course it isn't. If you had a free press in Turkey, and you could bring some sort of pressure on the government, you could embarrass the government because the government is disregarding binding judgments or disregarding the Human Rights Committee, then there might be a chance that they might implement something. But as of now, and certainly with this megalomaniac in power, you can expect nothing from Turkey right now. I'm quite worried, actually, about the drilling
Yeah, that's right.
Because
The other thing is, apart from Augusta,
you could have a flare-up of violence in a situation like that. I mean, if someone is drilling in your exclusive economic zone, you have a right to push them off. But if you try to push them off, you might find yourself bombed. It's like Iran and the Strait of Hormuz and the Gulf of Oman.
yes.
You know, I mean, I'm just so weary, bored with false flags. I mean, we're being led by the nose. We're being subjected to all sorts of false flags. As I said, what is the function of intelligence services? Intelligence services are fake news factories. That's what they're there for. And what I can't believe is that after all the lying that we were subjected to in 2003 with the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, that we're supposed to listen to Pompeo and have him tell us that there's Hezbollah in Venezuela.
That's right.
Give me a break. Hezbollah. I mean, just anything goes. I mean, they can invent anything, n'importe quoi, and they get away with it. So, and unfortunately, there's a lot of people who would believe that anything that comes from the CIA is the truth, because we are by definition the good guys. And the Brits think that they are by definition the good guys. And I mean, if you read the book by Lord Hanning on the Cyprus issue,
Yes, I know.
amazing.
Yes.
I mean, it's so self-serving. It is just so primitive. He got a publisher for it. And so, any other questions? We're going to have, yes, and then we have a nice wine.
My question is, how far Greece is or should be, according to you, concerned in view of the recent movements by Turkey and the drillings that's going on right now?
Of course, it is serious. It is dangerous. Unless the European Union uses some muscle. Turkey, Erdogan is a type of person who will push the limits as far as he can until someone says stop. And the European Union says, please stop, please.
But Greece has all the means to, and Cyprus to veto and bring the European Union to a court.
That is what
Which will happen. What happened? That happened in 2004 when Cyprus became a member. We vetoed the enlargement. I'm the Consul of Greece under 20 years in the service. So
I would have wanted to see,
but
I'm absolutely amazed. Not only that Greece doesn't use its muscle, that but other countries in Europe who could block EU legislation or EU norms don't use it. Because, I mean, if I were Viktor Orban, having been insulted so often by Jean-Claude Juncker, I would just to try, it's for fun, block something. I say, you think we're going to go along? No, I'm going to block it. Just for fun. And again, Greece would have an opportunity.
And Cyprus.
Yeah, and also
Actually, Cyprus and Greece.
Yeah, but I'd like to know behind the scenes what kind of arm twisting and heavy duty, threats
There's a limit.
are there, because the UK plays hardball, France plays hardball, the United States plays hardball. Can they take it? Can they take the heat? I'm not sure. The fact that Orban has put up with so much mobbing from Brussels would indicate to me that on balance, it's better not to do anything than to do something. But of course that you could only be able to judge it if you are in there and you're seeing how it goes.